April 14, 1945. The war in Europe was entering its final chaotic weeks. Across the Atlantic, in the high plains of Colorado, spring arrived with late snow flurries and the promise of warmer days ahead. At Camp Greeley, a small prisoner of war facility nestled between wheat fields and cattle ranches, 43 German women sat in the mess hall, eating their evening meal of thin soup and dark bread. They wore faded gray uniforms, remnants of the Women's Auxiliary Corps they had served in before their capture 6 months earlier in France. Their faces reflected the weariness of uncertainty, of waiting for news about a war everyone knew was ending, but no one could predict the aftermath of. Among them sat 24-year-old Margrethe Schulz, a former radio operator from Munich who had spent the last 6 months trying to make sense of her new reality as an enemy prisoner on American soil. She had learned to navigate the strange routines of camp life, the peculiar kindness of some guards mixed with the cold indifference of others, and the desperate loneliness that came from being thousands of miles from everything she had once called home. As she lifted her spoon to her lips, the mess hall door opened with a gust of cold air. Captain Jane Morrison entered, accompanied by a tall man in civilian clothes, wearing a weathered cowboy hat and boots that had clearly seen years of hard work. The room fell silent as it always did when authority entered, but this time there was something different in the air. The man looked uncomfortable, turning his hat in his hands, as Captain Morrison called for attention. The women rose from their benches in practiced unison, their military training still evident despite months of captivity. "Ladies, this is Mr. Thomas Henderson. He owns the Triple H Ranch about 5 miles from here," Captain Morrison announced. The man nodded awkwardly, his weathered face creasing into what might have been an attempt at a smile. "Mr. Henderson and several other local ranchers have made a request that I've decided to grant. They would like to invite some of you to attend a Sunday dinner at his ranch this coming weekend." The words hung in the air like something from a dream. An invitation? To leave the camp? To attend a social gathering with Americans? Mr. Henderson stepped forward, speaking slowly and deliberately. "My wife Sarah and we thought you ladies might appreciate a home-cooked meal and some time away from here. Nothing fancy, just Sunday dinner like we do every week. We know you're far from home." Captain Morrison explained that 20 women would be selected based on conduct records. They would be transported by truck on Sunday morning and returned by evening. As Captain Morrison read the selected names, Margrethe felt her heart race when her own was called. In the barracks that night, the women gathered in excited groups. "Did you see how formally he invited us?" said Greta Hoffman, a 31-year-old former clerk. "I think someone is getting married." The suggestion sparked immediate speculation. It made perfect sense. Why else would ranchers invite enemy prisoners to their home for a formal Sunday meal? The elaborate invitation, the mention of his wife, the Sunday timing, all pointed toward a celebration, perhaps a wedding. The next morning brought an energy to the barracks that hadn't existed since the women's arrival at Camp Greeley. Word of the upcoming Sunday dinner had spread through the entire compound, and even those who hadn't been selected found themselves caught up in the preparations. The 20 chosen women had only 4 days to make themselves presentable for what they believed would be an American wedding celebration, and they approached the task with the same dedication they had once applied to their wartime duties. Margrethe sat on her narrow bunk watching as Anna Weber carefully unpicked the hem of her only civilian dress, a faded blue cotton garment she had been wearing when captured. "If I let this out just a little," Anna murmured in German, her fingers working the threads with practiced precision, "it will hang better. More formal, you understand?" Around them, similar scenes of preparation unfolded. Women pooled their meager possessions, sharing the few items of makeup that had survived their journey across the Atlantic. A single tube of lipstick was carefully rationed among 6 women. A compact mirror with a cracked surface was passed from hand to hand as each woman attempted to see herself clearly for the first time in months. Greta Hoffman had taken charge of what she called the gift committee. "We cannot arrive at a wedding empty-handed," she declared, with the authority of someone who understood social obligations. "It would be disrespectful to the bride and groom, and it would shame us as guests." But what could prisoners of war possibly create as a wedding gift? They had no money, no materials, no access to shops or markets. What they did have was time, skill, and desperation to contribute something meaningful to what they imagined would be a joyous occasion. The solution came from unexpected sources. Margarete, who had learned basic embroidery from her grandmother, offered to create something decorative if they could find fabric and thread. The camp's supply sergeant, a middle-aged woman named Dorothy Chen, who had always treated the German prisoners with quiet dignity, seemed to understand their desire to participate in normal social customs. When Greta approached her with their request, Sergeant Chen disappeared into the supply room and returned with several squares of white cotton fabric and 2 spools of thread, one white and one pale blue. "I don't know what you're planning," Sergeant Chen said carefully, "but I suppose there's no regulation against prisoners doing needlework during their free time." Her eyes held a knowing glint that suggested she understood more than she was saying. Over the next 3 evenings, Margarete worked by the dim light of the barracks, her fingers creating delicate patterns on the white fabric. She embroidered intertwined rings, symbols of marriage that were universal across cultures, surrounded by small flowers and leaves. Anna sat beside her, helping to plan the design and offering encouragement when Margarete's eyes grew tired from the close work. Other women contributed their own skills to the collective preparation. Lotte Schneider, who had worked in her father's bakery before the war, carefully saved portions of her bread rations and traded with other prisoners to accumulate enough flour and sugar to attempt making something special. The camp kitchen staff, bemused but sympathetic, allowed her access one evening to create small cookies, simple but made with care. Sunday morning arrived with crystalline clarity, the Colorado sky stretching endlessly blue above the camp. The 20 selected women gathered near the main gate at 8 o'clock, their nervous energy palpable in the crisp spring air. They had dressed in their best available clothes, a collection of mended dresses, carefully pressed uniform pieces, and borrowed items that created an oddly formal appearance. Margarete wore her cleanest gray auxiliary uniform, with a white collar she had washed 3 times. Anna had managed to fashion her hair into an elegant bun, using pins borrowed from 5 different women. The embroidered handkerchief Marguerite had created was carefully wrapped in brown paper, tied with a piece of string that Greta had somehow convinced to look decorative. Lotte carried her small cookies in a tin provided by the kitchen staff, wrapped in a cloth napkin. The women stood in an informal line, looking more like wedding guests than prisoners of war, their faces reflecting anticipation mixed with anxiety about whether they had properly prepared for an American celebration. 2 military trucks arrived to transport them, driven by young American soldiers who seemed bemused by the prisoners' formal attire. "You ladies look like you're going to church," commented Private Williams, a freckled young man from Texas. "I guess, Mr. Henderson's Sunday dinners are more special than I thought." The women smiled politely, not correcting his assumption, still convinced they were heading to something far more significant than an ordinary meal. The drive through the Colorado countryside revealed a landscape the women had only glimpsed through camp fences. Rolling plains stretched toward distant mountains, their peaks still crowned with snow. Cattle grazed in vast pastures that seemed impossibly large compared to the carefully divided fields of Germany. Farmhouses stood scattered across the land, each commanding a territory that would have contained entire villages back home. The scale of everything spoke to an abundance the women had never personally experienced, even before the war. The Triple H Ranch appeared as they crested a low hill, a sprawling collection of buildings centered around a white 2-story farmhouse with a wide porch. Corrals held horses and cattle, barns stood freshly painted, and several other trucks were already parked near the house. As their vehicle pulled to a stop, Margarete could see other people gathered on the porch and in the yard, at least a dozen men in clean work shirts and pressed jeans, their cowboy hats in hand. Mr. Henderson stepped forward to greet them, accompanied by a woman with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her face was weathered but kind, her eyes crinkling at the corners as she smiled. "Welcome, ladies," she said in clear English. "I'm Sarah Henderson. We're so glad you could join us today." The German women climbed down from the trucks, clutching their small gifts, their eyes scanning the gathering for signs of the bride and groom they expected to see. Anna leaned close to Margarete and whispered in German, "Perhaps the ceremony was earlier? Perhaps we're only here for the reception?" Margarete nodded, though doubt was beginning to creep into her mind. Something about the casual atmosphere didn't quite match what she expected from a wedding celebration. But before she could voice her concerns, Mrs. Henderson was gesturing them toward long tables set up in the yard, laden with more food than Margarete had seen in years. The tables stretched across the Henderson ranch yard like an image from a dream, covered in white cloths that fluttered gently in the spring breeze. But it was the food that made the German women stop in their tracks, their eyes widening with disbelief. At the center of the main table sat an enormous roasted ham, its surface glazed and glistening in the midday sun, surrounded by bowls of mashed potatoes, green beans, corn, fresh bread, butter, 3 different pies, and pitchers of what appeared to be fresh milk and lemonade. Margarete felt her throat tighten at the sight. In Germany, even before the worst of the wartime shortages, such a feast would have been reserved for the most important occasions. A christening, perhaps, or certainly a wedding. The sheer abundance before her seemed to confirm everything they had assumed about this gathering. This had to be a wedding celebration. Nothing else could justify such extravagance, such a display of plenty in a world where most people were learning to survive on less and less. Mrs. Henderson, Greta stepped forward, her English careful and formal. "We bring gifts for the bride and groom. We wish to congratulate them on their marriage." She held out the wrapped embroidered handkerchief with both hands, a gesture of respect and formality. The smile on Sarah Henderson's face faltered slightly, replaced by confusion. She glanced at her husband, who had been greeting the American ranchers, and Thomas Henderson turned toward the German women with a puzzled expression. "Bride and groom? Bride and groom?" he repeated slowly. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand. There's no wedding here today." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of confusion that spread through both groups. The German women exchanged glances, their carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. Anna whispered in German to Margarete, "Did we misunderstand the day? Perhaps the wedding is next week?" But Margarete was looking at the faces of the American ranchers, seeing genuine puzzlement rather than the knowing amusement of people keeping a secret. "You invited us to Sunday dinner," Marguerite said carefully, stepping forward. "Such a feast, such formality. In Germany, this would be for a wedding or very important celebration. We thought someone was getting married." Understanding dawned on Sarah Henderson's face, followed immediately by something that looked like both sympathy and amusement. She moved closer to the German women, her voice gentle as she explained, "Oh, my dears, no, there's no wedding. This is just Sunday dinner. This is what we do every Sunday after church. The family and neighbors, we gather and share a meal together. It's our weekly tradition. Just Sunday dinner." The words seemed impossible to comprehend. This abundance, this celebration of food and fellowship, happened every single week. Margarete felt the carefully wrapped handkerchief in her hands suddenly become heavy with the weight of her misunderstanding. Around her, the other German women were processing the same revelation, their faces showing a mixture of embarrassment and something deeper, something that spoke to the vast gulf between their experience and American reality. Lotte, still holding her tin of carefully hoarded cookies, spoke quietly in German. "They eat like this every week? While we have been starving, they have been eating like this every Sunday?" There was no anger in her voice, only a kind of stunned disbelief that bordered on grief. Sarah Henderson seemed to sense the shift in the German women's emotions, the weight of realization settling over them like a heavy blanket. Instead of dwelling on the misunderstanding, she gently guided them toward the tables with a warmth that suggested she understood more than she said. "Please, sit with us," she invited, gesturing to chairs that had been arranged around the long tables. "We're honored to have you here, wedding or not." Her smile held genuine kindness, and slowly the German women found themselves taking seats among the American ranchers and their families. Margarete sat between Anna and a young rancher who introduced himself as Daniel Morrison, no relation to Captain Morrison at the camp, he assured them with a grin. He looked to be in his mid-20s, with sun-weathered skin and hands that showed years of hard labor. As Thomas Henderson stood to say grace, an American custom the German women recognized, they bowed their heads in a moment of shared reverence that transcended nationality. When the blessing ended, the serving of food began, and the passive side, German women watched in continued amazement as heaping portions were placed on their plates. The first bites of ham were almost overwhelming. The meat was tender, rich with flavors the women had nearly forgotten existed. Real butter melted into warm bread. The mashed potatoes were creamy and abundant. For several minutes, conversation was sparse as the German women simply ate, their eyes occasionally meeting in silent acknowledgement of what this meal represented. It was Anna who first broke the silence with a question directed at Mrs. Henderson. "How is it possible? Such food, every week? The war, it has not touched you here?" Sarah Henderson set down her fork, considering her answer carefully. "The war has touched us," she said quietly. "We've sent our sons and brothers and husbands to fight. We've rationed sugar and gas and other things, but you're right that we haven't known the kind of hardship that Europe has suffered. The fighting hasn't come to our land. Our cities haven't been bombed." She paused, her eyes moving across the faces of the German women. "I can't imagine what you've been through, what you've seen." Daniel Morrison spoke up, his voice carrying a note of hesitation. "My brother John is in Europe right now. Or was. We haven't heard from him in 3 weeks." He looked at Margarete, and she saw in his eyes the same fear she had lived with for months regarding her own brother. "He's with Patton's army, somewhere in Germany. Every day we wonder if he's safe, if he's scared, if he's coming home." The admission created a crack in the invisible wall between the two groups. Marguerite found herself responding before she could think better of it. "My brother Klaus was on the Eastern Front. He died at Stalingrad 2 years ago." The words came out in English, her accent thick but clear. "He was 19 years old. He wrote letters about being cold and hungry and wanting to come home." Daniel's eyes met hers with sudden understanding, a recognition that the grief of war crossed all boundaries. Around the table, other conversations had quieted as people listened. The afternoon sun climbed higher as the meal continued, and with it, the barriers between the two groups began to dissolve in ways none of them had anticipated. Greta found herself in conversation with an older rancher named Frank Miller, who spoke slowly and used hand gestures to help bridge the language gaps. He told her about his cattle, about the challenges of ranch life, about his daughter who was studying to be a teacher in Denver. She listened carefully, responding with stories of her own work before the war, her life in a small town outside Berlin that sounded not so different from the rural communities surrounding Camp Greeley. What struck Margrethe most profoundly as she observed these interactions was how ordinary the Americans were. The propaganda she had been raised with had painted them as decadent and weak, as people who understood nothing of sacrifice or duty. But the ranchers around her spoke of hard work, of early mornings and difficult seasons, of helping neighbors and building community. These were values she recognized, values that existed independent of national boundaries or political ideologies. When Mrs. Henderson brought out the pies, apple and cherry and pecan, the German women had already begun to relax into the gathering. Anna accepted a slice of apple pie and took her first bite, her eyes closing briefly in appreciation. "My grandmother made apple kuchen," she said to Sarah Henderson. "Different from this, but the taste of apples and cinnamon, it brings back memories." Sarah smiled warmly. "Food has a way of connecting us to home, doesn't it? Even when home feels very far away." The simple observation carried weight that both women understood, a recognition that displacement and longing were universal experiences. As the afternoon progressed, some of the younger children from neighboring ranches arrived, running through the yard, with the boundless energy of youth. They were curious about the German women, staring with wide eyes at these strangers who spoke a different language and wore unusual clothes. One little girl, perhaps 5 years old, approached Margarete shyly and held out a dandelion she had picked. Margarete accepted it with a smile, tucking it behind her ear, and the child giggled with delight before running back to her mother. It was Thomas Henderson who finally addressed what everyone had been thinking, but no one had wanted to voice. He stood, clearing his throat to get everyone's attention. "Ladies," he began, looking at the German women, "I want you to know why we invited you here today. Some folks in town, they don't understand. They ask why we'd want enemy prisoners at our table." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But my Sarah and I, we figure you're not our enemies. You're just people who got caught up in something bigger than any of us. You're far from home, and you're probably scared about what comes next. We thought maybe sharing a meal, showing you some kindness, that's what neighbors do." His words hung in the air, simple but profound in their implications. Margarete felt tears prickling at her eyes, a response she tried to suppress but couldn't quite manage. Around her, other women were similarly affected, their faces showing emotions they had kept carefully controlled for months. That evening, back in the barracks at Camp Greeley, Marguerite sat on her bunk with a piece of paper and a pencil, trying to find words adequate to describe what she had experienced. The other women had already begun to settle into their evening routines, but conversations kept breaking out as they processed the day's events. The misunderstanding about the wedding had become a source of gentle humor among them now, but beneath the laughter lay something more profound, a shift in how they understood their captors and perhaps themselves. Margarete had been writing letters to her mother in Munich for months, though she had no way of knowing if any of them had arrived. The postal system in Germany was chaotic, and her mother had been evacuated from the city after the last major bombing raid. Still, the act of writing brought comfort. A way of maintaining connection to the person she had been before the war transformed everything. She began as she always did, with a date and a formal greeting, but then she paused, her pencil hovering over the paper as she tried to capture the day's strange mixture of embarrassment and revelation. "Dear Mutti," she wrote in German, her handwriting small and precise to conserve the precious paper. "Today I attended what I thought was a wedding celebration. We prepared for days, creating gifts and making ourselves presentable, convinced that the American ranchers were inviting us to honor a bride and groom. You can imagine our embarrassment when we discovered it was simply their Sunday dinner, something they do every single week. Mutti, I wish I could make you understand the abundance we saw. A ham larger than any I remember even before the war, fresh bread with real butter, vegetables and fruits and 3 kinds of pie. And this is what they call an ordinary Sunday meal." She paused again, aware that her next words might be dangerous if the letter was intercepted and read by authorities on either side. But the need to express her confusion and her changing understanding was too strong to suppress completely. "I have been thinking about what we were told about America, about the Americans themselves. We learned that they were soft, morally corrupt, incapable of real sacrifice. But Mutti, the people I met today were not so different from us. They work hard. They care for their families. They worry about their sons and brothers fighting in Europe, just as we worry about Klaus, though of course Klaus will never come home." The mention of her brother brought the familiar ache of grief, but she pressed forward with her writing. "One of the ranchers, a young man named Daniel, told me about his brother who is somewhere in Germany right now with the American army. I saw in his eyes the same fear we have all lived with. His brother could be in the same places where Klaus fought and died. Perhaps they even stood on the same ground, separated only by time and the side they were told to fight for. How strange that feels, Mutti. How wrong it seems that these people who share our values and our griefs were our enemies." She knew she was being too honest, perhaps dangerously so, but something about the day had broken open a door in her thinking that she could not close again. The weeks following that first Sunday dinner brought changes to Camp Greeley that no one had anticipated. Thomas Henderson returned the following Tuesday with a request to speak with Captain Morrison. He stood in her office, hat in hand, explaining that several of the ranchers in the area needed help with spring planting and wondered if some of the German women prisoners might be available for work details. The request was unusual but not unprecedented. Male German prisoners across America had been working on farms and in factories for months, helping to address the labor shortage created by American men serving overseas. Captain Morrison considered the request carefully. The women under her supervision had been model prisoners, causing no trouble and following every regulation with precision. Many of them seemed to be languishing in the camp, their skills and energy wasted on make-work tasks and endless waiting. The opportunity for meaningful work, for interaction with the community beyond the fences, might be beneficial for everyone involved. She agreed to a trial arrangement. 10 women, including Marguerite and Anna, would be transported to local ranches 3 days a week to help with agricultural work. The first morning of the new arrangement arrived with a mixture of excitement and nervousness among the clown and selected women. They climbed into the truck, wearing their work uniforms, uncertain what would be expected of them but grateful for any change to their monotonous routine. Marguerite and Anna were assigned to the Henderson Ranch, along with Greta and 2 other women named Helga and Liese. When they arrived, Sarah Henderson was waiting with work gloves, simple dresses to wear over their uniforms to protect them from dirt, and a warm smile that had become familiar. The work was hard but honest. They helped plant vegetables in the kitchen garden, mended fences, cleaned animal pens, and performed dozens of other tasks that kept a ranch functioning. For women who had spent months in captivity with little purpose beyond surviving each day, the physical labor was surprisingly satisfying. Their muscles ached, their hands developed blisters that slowly turned to calluses, but they felt useful in a way they hadn't since before their capture. More importantly, they found themselves working alongside the Henderson family and neighboring ranchers, sharing tasks and slowly building something that resembled friendship. Daniel Morrison began appearing at the Henderson ranch regularly, ostensibly to help with heavier tasks, but clearly interested in the work the German women were doing. He made an effort to learn German phrases, his pronunciation terrible but his enthusiasm genuine. The women responded by practicing their English with him, creating conversations that mixed both languages and involved considerable laughter at misunderstandings. Marguerite found herself looking forward to these interactions, to the way Daniel treated them, not as enemies or prisoners, but simply as people learning to navigate an unfamiliar world. One afternoon, while mending a section of fence, Daniel worked alongside Marguerite in comfortable silence before speaking. "I got a letter from John yesterday," he said quietly. "My brother. He's in Bavaria now. Says the fighting is over in his area. He wrote about the German people he's meeting, how they seem just as tired of the war as we are." Marguerite paused in her work, meeting his eyes. "I am glad your brother is safe," she said simply, and meant it with surprising sincerity. May 8, 1945. The announcement came over the radio in the camp's common room, crackling through the static with words that everyone had been expecting, but somehow still arrived as a shock. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Victory in Europe Day, the Americans called it. And across the United States, celebrations erupted with church bells ringing and crowds filling the streets in jubilation. At Camp Greeley, the atmosphere was far more complicated, a strange mixture of relief that the killing had stopped and uncertainty about what victory and defeat would mean for the women held behind the wire. Marguerite sat on her bunk that evening, listening to the muted sounds of American soldiers celebrating in the distance. Around her, the German women were silent, each processing the news in her own way. The war was over, which meant they would be sent home, back to Germany. But what Germany would they be returning to? The reports filtering through had painted a picture of complete devastation. Cities reduced to rubble, millions dead or displaced, the country divided and occupied by foreign armies, the ideology they had been taught to believe in revealed as something far darker than any of them had understood. Anna sat beside her, tears streaming silently down her face. "I don't know if my family is alive," she whispered in German. "I don't know if our house is still standing. I don't even know which zone Hamburg is in now." She looked at Marguerite with eyes full of fear. "What are we going home to?" It was a question none of them could answer. Over the following weeks, the process of repatriation began for German prisoners across America, but the situation for the women at Camp Greeley remained uncertain, complicated by the fact that many had no confirmed families to return to. Captain Morrison called a meeting in early June to explain the procedures. They would be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe, provided with documentation, and released to make their way back to whatever remained of their homes. Her voice was professional but not unkind as she outlined the timeline. Transportation would be arranged within 8 weeks. The women should prepare themselves for departure and for the difficult conditions they would likely encounter upon arrival in Germany. The announcement left the barracks heavy with anxiety and whispered conversations that stretched late into the night. Marguerite found herself thinking about the life she had begun to build during her months of work at the Henderson Ranch. She had learned skills she never knew she possessed, discovered strengths she hadn't known existed. More than that, she had found acceptance and purpose in this strange place that was supposed to be enemy territory. The thought of leaving felt like tearing away from something precious, but the guilt of staying while her country suffered seemed equally unbearable. The internal conflict kept her awake most nights, staring at the ceiling and finding no clear answers. It was during one of their workdays at the ranch that Sarah Henderson approached Marguerite with careful words. "I know you're facing difficult decisions," she said gently. Thomas and I want you to know that if you choose to stay in America, we would be honored to sponsor you." The offer hung in the air, opening possibilities Marguerite had not dared consider. 7 years later, on a bright June morning in 1952, the Henderson Ranch once again prepared for a celebration. But this time, there was no misunderstanding about the occasion. White ribbons decorated the porch railings, flowers filled every available vase, and chairs had been arranged in neat rows, facing an arbor that Thomas Henderson had built with his own hands. Today there really was a wedding, and the entire community had gathered to witness it. Marguerite Schultz stood in Sarah Henderson's bedroom, looking at herself in the full-length mirror with a mixture of disbelief and joy. The white dress she wore had been Sarah's own wedding gown, altered to fit Margarita's smaller frame. Anna Weber fussed with the veil, her hands steady from years of nursing work at the county hospital where she now served as head surgical nurse. "You look beautiful," Anna said in English, the language that had become as natural to both of them as German. "Daniel is a lucky man." Margarete smiled at her friend's reflection in the mirror, remembering that first Sunday 7 years ago, when they had arrived at this ranch expecting to attend someone else's wedding, carrying handmade gifts and wearing their best prison clothes. The decision to stay in America had not been easy. Of the 10 women who had been working on the Manistee ranches, 6 had chosen to accept sponsorship and remain. Marguerite had been among them, sponsored by the Hendersons, who had offered her a room in their home and helped her find work as a translator for the county government. The transition from enemy prisoner to immigrant to citizen had been a long journey, marked by paperwork and interviews and the constant work of proving herself worthy of the second chance she had been given. Her relationship with Daniel Morrison had developed slowly over those years, built on shared work and growing respect that gradually deepened into something more. He had been patient with her fears and her guilt, understanding that her past would always be part of who she was. When he finally proposed 6 months ago, kneeling in the garden she had helped plant that first spring, she had said yes while crying tears that mixed grief for all she had lost with gratitude for all she had found. Now, as she walked down the aisle on Thomas Henderson's arm, the man who had become like a father to her, Marguerite saw the faces of the community that had accepted her. Greta sat in the front row beside her American husband. Other women from that original group of prisoners were scattered throughout the gathering, each having built new lives from the ruins of their old ones. And there, standing at the altar with tears in his eyes, was Daniel, the young rancher who had seen past her uniform to the person underneath. The ceremony was simple but profound. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the gathering erupted in applause. After the ceremony, tables were set up in the yard, laden with food that once again included a magnificent roasted ham. This time Margarete understood exactly what it meant. Not a wedding feast in the formal European sense, but something perhaps more meaningful, an American celebration of community, of second chances, of enemies who had become family.